Welcome back again. The sixth presentation for this class will be on the industrial aesthetics, purity, and perfection. We may think that industrial processes and something we call modernism may have started quite recently in the 19th, 20th century, but it has a long history, and that history is quite interesting, so we will be looking into it. So I'm showing you this example of a wonderful work, and I'm asking you, where and when was it made? Try to imagine a country or a place where it would have been made, and more specifically a time. So this is an object that was made in the Biedermeier period in Austria around 1823. So the origins of modern design go back much farther than we think they do in the 20th century. And again, this is one of those precedents of ceramics that is overlooked in histories of design, histories of art, histories of ceramics itself, and that I want to bring out today, that things sometimes happen at a very different time than we think they have. What about this teapot? When was it made and where? Well, it was made in Dewa in China around 1650. So again, what does modern design mean? What does industrialization mean? And what is the industrial aesthetics? An example from 1919. So again, I've talked before about the radical approach to form and also surface that we find in ceramics, sometimes way before such radical minimalism happened in other art form. And this is an example by Theo van Doesburg from 1919. Let's go back in time much farther to Egypt, and this is an image of potters at work. So you can see that even as far back as millennium before our era, in Egypt, potters were working communally. They were making wares in large quantities. There was the repetition of form and so on. So industrial processes were used at that time. Molds were used, sophisticated kilns, the wheel was used, and the earliest glass making also happens in Egypt. I couldn't find any image of very early Egyptian glass, but this is an example from Phoenicia from 500 BCE, and on the right, Roman glass being made, which was the most sophisticated glass in antiquity. And of course, glass is related to ceramic technology and the development of industrial processes in ceramics. Kilns and wheels go back a long time. Actually, the wheel was invented specifically for pottery making, and probably up to a millennium before it was used for transportation. So that's an interesting precedent as well that's often overlooked in histories of civilizations and culture. This is an example of a dragon kiln in China, as it looks with its roof on the left, and then as it's been excavated on the right with remnants of the firing that took place in such a kiln. And dragon kiln in China go back more than 1,000 years, and the technologies of ceramics go even farther back than this, all the way to the very origin of ceramics and pottery making, close to 20,000 years ago in that part of the world. This image shows a stacking sagger. So saggers were built out of rough stoneware clays and could be stacked, and inside each one of them the ware would be protected from the flame and from ashes, and also the system permitted the stacking of large quantities of ware into those huge dragon kiln. And this is also a form of industrial process going back 1,000 years or more in the history of ceramics. A contemporary example from Bhaktapur, Nepal, here, where we see a potter at work. This type of wheel would have been used in Southeast Asia for thousands of years. This is the type of ware being made today, but such ware would have been made for centuries and centuries in those cultures for the need of the people, made in huge quantities and through the work of all communities. This is a very interesting image. It's from Uruk, Mesopotamia, and it dates from 4000 BCE. So those objects are 6,000 years old. And they show you standardized pottery to measure food for workers. And it's the earliest example of standardization, which is a characteristic of industrial processes, going back that far back in time. Another interesting object is the Baghdad pottery, dating from 200 BCE, and a battery like this would generate enough electricity to solder precious metal in jewelry making. So this is an example of the kind of jewelry that would have been made using this battery to use the principle of electricity to make such refined and complex objects. And I'm showing you here two examples of contemporary artists using the Baghdad pottery to power an iPod and to create electrical energy in their installations. So early use of molds and multiples are interesting to look into. Molds were used very early on in ceramic history, and those are examples of rhytons made in Greece in the 4th century BCE. And they were made with the use of press molds, so often multiples were made as well. The Romans used molds to make their wares very often. You have an example of a mold on the left made out of fired clay, and on the right an example coming from such a mold where clay would be press molded into the form as it's spin on the wheel, and multiples could be made with intricate decoration using that process. An example of a moche mold coming from Pre-Columbian America. Again, the use of mold was very common in Pre-Columbian cultures. Those molds were made out of fired clay, left very porous so that there would be absorption and you could release the fresh clay pressed into them to make multiples again later on. And on the right, an image from Mesopotamia, which is a mold for glass beads. So molten glass would be poured into those molds to create the beads for all kinds of purposes. Two examples of moche molds again. So it creates a negative concave form from which convex objects can be printed and reassembled into other objects. In China, we have the same thing. Clay molds were used for bronze casting. You have two examples here, the one on the left to make coins, the one on the right to make a very complex vase form. This is an example of a mold that would have been made out of ceramic material to cast melted bronze to make the type of objects we see on the right. And another mold dating from the Song dynasty. It's a drape mold that's been carved and then fired to fix the image and make the objects permanent and porous, over which clay could then be imprinted to create the type of ware we see on the right, this Yaozu ware bowl with the Celadon glaze. In Europe, I believe the earliest use of plaster molds were in the work of Palissy in France, and probably a bit earlier the Della Robbia family in 16th century Italy. And those are two examples of this type of work. Now, plaster itself was invented by the Romans in Roman times, probably around the time of the birth of Christ or so. But the use of plaster in ceramics happened quite late, and I believe those are examples of some of the earliest use of plaster molds to make those types of objects. Now let's come back to the Industrial Revolution in 19th century England. Those are views of Longton in Stoke-on-Trent, England in the 19th century, when there were hundreds of manufacturers of ceramics in that part of England in the Midlands. And the reason why ceramic factories were established in Staffordshire in the Midland of England in the 19th century was for a number of reasons. There was a lot of local clay that were readily available. Coal was very common to be mined locally as well for firing all those kilns that we see on this image. You can imagine the smoke and the pollution and the living conditions of those people when all those kilns were firing all at once, all the way until the 1950s. This is how those were made in England. And then there was also easy transportation because there was river systems that could be connected with canals to bring the ware to markets, to London, and then all over the world after that. So bottle kilns were very huge kilns. You can see the size of the kiln by the man standing in front of them on the left. And those kilns could be filled with tens of thousands of wares. And they're very unusual kilns where the kiln is inside the bottle and the bottle basically acts as a chimney. So again, the firing conditions, the working conditions were quite dramatic, and those were difficult times for workers, but the wares that they made is of great beauty, great sophistication. And again, an example of a ceramic factory in Stoke-on-Trent, England on the right, and the image of bottle kilns on a Cobridge porcelain vase from the 19th century. So again, an image of a pottery site in 19th century England, and on the right, the interior view of a kiln where the saggers are being stacked in the kiln, which is again a technology that comes originally from China and then was used all over the world in industrial processes. Let's talk a little bit about the great industrialist Josiah Wedgwood, who lived between 1730 and 1795. Josiah Wedgwood has made his presence felt in most of the presentations I've given so far, because he's one of the greatest potter who ever lived, and also he was a great industrialist. He made extraordinary work collaboratively with people like the artist John Flaxman. He was an early user of transfer printing, which was invented by Josiah Spode in 1781-84, who was also a manufacturer of ceramics in the Midlands of England at that time. This is a self-portrait of John Flaxman on the left, and the portrait of Josiah Wedgwood that he made for his patron around that same time as well. The one on the left is a plaster model, but the one on the right is a basalt ware porcelain portrait that Josiah Wedgwood produced from the model that John Flaxman provided to him. Josiah Wedgwood was a revolutionary in many ways. He was the first person to publish a catalog to distribute and promote and sell his ware as far back as 1815. And the etchings in the catalog were the work of famous artist and poet William Blake. He was also the first to open a showroom in London for marketing his ware and selling directly to the public. He was also a social revolutionary. He would build proper housing for his worker, provide them with education for their kids, for health care, and he was also a very early abolitionist to try to get rid of slavery. And he made tens of thousands of those medallions that he distributed all over the world, including the United States, to promote the cause of abolitionist politics. And on the right you have a Portland vase button, also made by Wedgwood from his very celebrated vase. This is the Wedgwood factory that he built in Etruria at the end of the 18th century to produce his ware that are celebrated and known all over the world. I have mentioned his son, Thomas Wedgwood, before, who was one of the early discoverer of photography. And on the right you have a silhouette made with a camera of the two Erasmus Darwin, grandfather and father of Charles, whose mother was a Wedgwood. So the Wedgwood is a very influential figure in culture because of his contribution through his work and his social activism, but also because he was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who we know very well as the proponent of evolution theory. So Josiah Wedgwood's work is very extraordinary. He was also a radical designer. You can see that those designs from 1764 are also incredibly modern and would be totally credible if they had been designed as recently as last week, really. I'm showing you this wonderful teapot by Thomas Barker from 1780, again inspired by Yixing wares from China, something we have looked into in the previous presentations as well. And you see examples of that continuing with the work of Wedgwood from the 18th century and the work of contemporary artist John Turrell, who designed some black basalt ware just about a decade ago. Some example of catalogs following in the footsteps of Josiah Wedgwood. All manufacturers produce catalogs to distribute and market their ware, and those are examples of ironstone, which is a type of stoneware, shapes from that time. And then a plate by Wedgwood showing a potter at work. This is showing you how to transfer printing, how the objects were made. And on the right, a model of a wheel with a spinner, which is an invention of Wedgwood as well, so that somebody could rotate a wheel that would activate the potter's wheel where the work would be made. This is the earliest porcelain made in England, dating from 1764. We've looked at the history of porcelain making some already. It's a very complex story, starting at Meissen in around 1710. But the earliest example made in England is from 1768, from March 14 actually, and this is the actual object. Let's look at some early industrial designers from the 20th century mostly, but one of the earliest one was Henry Cole from 1846, and he was the first to design an all-white dinnerware, which is something very common and almost universal these days. But he was the first to do such a thing. Christopher Dresser, working in the middle of the 19th century as well, was a pioneer of modern design. His work is very contemporary in feeling, very radical in its approach to minimal form, and he was tremendously influential, and many people say he was 50 years ahead of his time. And I'm showing you some example of his work in ceramics. He worked in all kinds of material, not just as a ceramic designer, but his ceramic designs are quite extraordinary. They are often influenced by historical precedent and make references to pre-Columbian ceramics and ceramics from other cultures, but always with a reinvention of the form that are very characteristic to his stylistic approach to making ceramics. Many early and radical modernist designers were women, and this is an example by Jutta Sittke from 1902. And I will just go through many images. Again, it's to introduce you to the work of wonderful makers who did extraordinary work very early on at the beginning of the 20th century, using industrial processes, mold making, slip casting, multiples, and an approach to form that's very radical and quite extraordinary, as I've mentioned to you before with the work of Michael Powolny from 1906, where both the radicalism of the form, the minimalism of the decoration is something you will not find in other art form for decades yet. It is interesting to consider how extraordinarily avant-garde those objects are and how fresh they still feel to us, and how we would integrate them into our environment up to 100 years after they have been designed. And it's interesting, and I hope some of you will want to make notes of some of those makers and research them further and find out other things that they may have done, and how much their contributions to the world of design, to the world of ceramics, and to the world of cultures is something that's been largely overlooked. At the Bauhaus school in Germany, Theodor Bogler was the celebrated teacher of ceramic and designed some wonderful objects in collaboration with his colleague Lindig. And you have here example of their work in an exhibitions of Bauhaus wear that took place recently. There was the centenary of the Bauhaus happening in this year actually, and so there were celebrations all over the world. And recently, Matthias Kaiser republished the wares designed by those artists, and it's interesting to see again how they can be integrated into contemporary life. Margaret Wildenheim, who was a student at the Bauhaus, did wonderful design work as well, and she designed for industrial manufacturing, but also was celebrated as a potter of handmade pots. Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus, designed this teapot and cup and saucer in 1969, and it is still in production today. So some of those objects are sometimes quite interesting. They go into all kinds of interesting directions. This was designed for the Cunard transatlantic line to be placed on boats for saving space, but of course it would pour very badly. And they're collector's item now because of their weird design and excessive approach to function, but they don't work really well at all. Kazimir Malevich, the suprematist artist, designed teapots and cups in 1923 Russia. This is an example of suprematist cups that he designed at the time. So there was a lot of relationship between art forms and so on and so forth. Many artists designed for factories, and Alexander Rodchenko is an example. And designers from all over the world approach the problem of modern design in ceramics in all kinds of very interesting ways. One of the most extreme examples of that is Nicolas Suetin, who was also a suprematist artist, designing for manufacturing of porcelain in Russia just after the revolution. And the work, again, is of great radical minimalism, very avant-garde, very connected to what was happening in art and in painting and sculpture at the time, but reinserting it into the context of domestic life, daily life. Sonia Delaunay, working in France, Vasily Kandinsky, again while he was in Russia at the time before immigrating, incorporating his discoveries in abstraction in ceramic designs. In Italy, Tullio dal Bisola was an early proponent of modernism in ceramics. In the United States, Paul Schregengost, and again, many women designers, Greta Marx, Susie Cooper, working in England, one of the great designers of the 20th century, both at the level of form and surface. Wonderful variety of solutions for that problem. Clarice Cliff, also working in England in the 1930s, mostly known for some radical forms she designed, but for the very wonderful surface decoration, all hand painted with a crew of women working under her supervisions in a factory context at that time. And Clarice Cliff was a great inventor of designs and surfaces and patterns, and her use of color is quite amazing. In the United States, Russell Wright from the 1950s, and the work still being produced up to now. The same with Fiesta Ware by Frederick Arton Reed, still produced today and very, very popular. Edith Heath, working in North San Francisco in the 1950s. Eva Zeisel, possibly the greatest designer of ceramic in the 20th century. She died at the age of 105 in 2011. An example of her very influential and seminal work. Let's look at Canada for a while, because it's quite interesting to introduce some Canadian content into those presentations. This is from Medalta in Alberta, who made this type of ware between the days of 1950-1960 when they closed. In the 1950s, Erta Gertz, working in BC, was making this type of ware using mold making and slip casting. In Quebec, we have a factory making ceramics at Ceramique de Beauce in the 1950s all the way to the early 1980s. Aurel Bouchard, working as an independent maker, his factory was in the garage of his house, and he was making this type of ware using industrial processes in the 1950s. Then we need to address also the problem or the possibilities of computer technologies in ceramics, and going back in time to look at timekeeping devices. And an example from Greece and an example from Egypt, where both those objects would be containing water that would be released from a small hole over a specific period of time, and that time would be recorded as the level of water would go down inside the object. There is a Tonina calendar from Mexico, so this is again a ceramic object that is a calendar for the passage of time. So computer technologies are quite recent, but they are embedded in the history of ceramic in an interesting way, because the first 3D virtual design that we see on the left by Martin Newell was inspired by a teapot that his wife had in the house. And he says, "Can I borrow your teapot so that I can create a 3D model of it?" And he used a teapot for a variety of reasons, because it's a very familiar form, but also it has an hollow interior and a spout. It has a handle, which is another type of topology in form. It has a lid that can be removed, and all of those things create specific problem for 3D design. And Martin Newell was the first to create a virtual 3D design, and the first thing he designed was a teapot. This is a model of his teapot on the left. And from that file, Dries Vergrugen makes Utanalog teapot. They're called Utanalog because it's an analog teapot. And it's also from Utah, because Martin Newell was working at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And this is a teapot he's designed in 2009. And again, an image of the Utah teapot and another version of it from that period in ceramics. And then there's all kinds of unusual objects being made using industrial processes. You have electric insulators. You have all kinds of weird teapots, like the famous Brown Betty you see on the right. Probably the most famous and successful design in the history of the field. Millions of those teapots have been produced since somebody anonymous designed that basic form. And it's a form being made today. So Wedgwood, always a great inventor, and his followers working at the factory. This is a very weird teapot from 1908, actually. Then you have things like Moche and Nazca flutes from pre-Columbian America. So flutes are an interesting objects that I'm introducing in this presentation, because although they're not necessarily industrial, they have a weirdness at the level of design that's quite interesting. Some of the most unusual objects ever produced in ceramic, and produced with the use of molds and made in multiples in Peruvia in pre-Columbian times, are what we call whistle pots. And what happens with those pots is you fill them with water, and when you pour from them, it creates a whistle effect inside the object. And often that whistle imitates the sound made by specific birds, and so on and so forth. And they're quite interesting things, and some of you may want to research them further. And there are graphs that shows you how to make those objects and how the principle works for the water to create a vacuum effect that whistles the object as you pour from it. And they're quite interesting for that reason alone. This is a little tea set that was designed for Mao Zedong in the 1960s, specifically for his personal use. So you can see that Mao Zedong had a very weird sense of taste. I'm showing you some ceramic grenade made very far back in time, and some Soviet models from the 1920s. So ceramic finds itself in all kinds of contexts, in all kinds of ways. And one of the most weird use of those kinds of war images was by Bruce Bairn's father, made after the First World War, and they were quite popular. Quite a number of them were made using transfer printing designs of war scenes that were put on domestic wares and bought by people who had lived through the war and wanted to retain a connection to it, I guess. Weird things of all kinds, like urinal, ceramic inhalers, weird ceramic mugs for people with problems handling and holding things, feeders, a watercolor palette, a hot water bottle, a ceramic jet for gas, a food mixing blade. Ceramic finds itself in all kinds of ways. This is a mold for rubber gloves, so those molds made out of porcelain could then be dipped into latex to make rubber gloves. And in just a few years ago, the British artist Claire Toomey made a very interesting installation where she made 1,345 cups based on the 1720 models, and she used it into an installation with an interactive aspect that you may want to research further as well. And this is my last image for today. It's a wig made out of ceramic, and also air curlers from the 19th century that could be eaten up and then used to curl air. So ceramic and industrial processes have a very interesting history that goes way back in time and is still very alive and relevant today. See you next week for the last aesthetic presentation on the material aesthetics before we move on to the themes after that.